Hey everybody. I want to talk about capitalism and slavery today, and the next couple of weeks as we conclude this class are going to be about the kind of international picture of how the United States changes and why the United States changes in the 1850s and 1860s, above all the Civil War and the end of slavery. I want to put it in an international context. And other people have put this in an international context, but relatively few have put it in the context of Russia. And that's what I want to do for the next few classes, is give us a sense of side by side what's happening in Russia and Ukraine and what's happening in the United States. So this is this is directly from a book I wrote called Oceans of Grain, but it does pair well and contradict, I think, in some ways, Harry Watson's take. I'll start by talking about capitalism and slavery today, and then I'll talk a little bit more about how I differ with Harry Watson. Okay, so I want to talk about the end of slavery in the United States and the end of serfdom in Russia and why those two things are linked. And I want to suggest that the US and Imperial Russia are kind of brothers from a different mother, that they are both on the edge of Europe and they both provide, by the 1850s and 1860s, the grain that feeds Europe. I want to talk today about the Crimean War. I want to talk about large family farms in Ukraine. I want to talk about the end of the Crimean War and what it does to Russia and how this leads to the end of serfdom. I want to talk about the boulevard barons, these people that I'm going to describe who are intimately connected with the expansion of railroads into Kansas and Missouri and places like this. And I want to talk about why those boulevard barons come to dominate and control the Republican Party by the time that Lincoln is elected, helping bring the Republican Party into power. But all this is bound up with this provisioning of Europe, feeding of Europe, that happens from the 1850s. So to start with, Catherine the Great, who reigns in Russia from 1762 to 1796, so going back basically to the time of the American Revolution, introduces a system bear with me, introduces a system for the control, a series of laws for Russia that change the way that serfdom operates and makes serfs much more like slaves in the Atlantic. So serfdom is an old system that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, but in trying to modernize Russia, what Catherine the Great does is makes it possible for landowners to separate the people who work on the land from the land itself. And under Catherine, what we see is the emergence of a new system in which people who are serfs can be sold from one person to another, can be sold to the state, to the Russian state, to serve as army or fodder for the army. In a way, this is telling, if we think about what's going on in Russia now, that the status of soldiers in Russia, going all the way back to the 18th century, is basically cannon fodder. So these serfs could be sold, and then people who were owned land, the large landowners, the serf owners, could then sell this land to other serf owners. And this is a quotation from a newspaper in Russia from the same time, and as it shows, you see here, this is the equivalent of a kind of slave sale that's made possible in Russia. Now, I don't want to suggest that they are the same. They're very different. Slavery in the American case is a system that's premised fundamentally on race. In the Russian system, what's similar about it is the things that I've stated, the ability for people who are serf owners to sort of sell those serfs. But there are important differences. The sort of connection to the land isn't always, depending on the region in Russia, isn't always locked in. And there's not a massive migration of slaves sold from one part of the area to the other like we saw in the Panic of 1837 or the westward expansion in the United States. There's not large-scale breaking up of families in Russia. But still, the system is similar, and this is, in fact, Catherine the Great's plan to modernize Russia, is to make it more like the Atlantic colonies in some ways. Nicholas I is the person who inherits this, and part of what Nicholas I does is he's in the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, he's effectively the policeman of Europe, and he sends Russian soldiers to put down insurrections by peasants in Poland and Hungary. Thank you. Poland and Hungary. He's the person who provides the soldiers to put those down. He is by the 1850s, early part of the 1850s, pretty much persuaded that Turkey, which is on the western edge of the Black Sea, and Turkey controls Istanbul, that little gateway that I talked about between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. He's fairly convinced that Turkey is going to fall apart. He refers to it as the sick man of Europe. And bear with me here for a second. Well, I get the quote, but I can't. Oh yeah, okay, thank you. Nicholas regarded the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire as his vassal for help because he had helped put down a failed invasion by Egypt. That Egypt had tried to invade in 1833, the Ottomans faced an invasion from Egypt, and he had helped put this down, and he was confident that basically the Ottoman Empire was under his control. Having put down the revolutions of 1848, he was smug, and he regarded the Sultan as his vassal and the European empires as kind of luckless henchmen. In February of 1853, he summoned the British ambassador in St. Petersburg and announced that the time had come for him to carve up the Ottoman Empire, which he called the sick man of Europe. He offered Britain the crumbs in his plan for invasion. They could have Crete, then an Ottoman province, along with Egypt. Speaking as a friend and gentleman, he continued, if England and myself can come to an understanding about this affair, I care little what the others may think or do. Now, you may think it's peculiar for Russia to have designs on the Black Sea, but in fact, this has been a kind of continuing theme of Russia for a long time. In 1853, with an army of 500,000 serfs and 1,000 cannon at his disposal, the Russian Empire began its 9th war against the Turks at the height of its power. Betting everything on a rapid victory, Nicholas intentionally provoked the Sultan and demanded that the Ottomans make him protector of all Greek Orthodox Christians in Ottoman lands. The Battle of Sinope is the thing that makes this a European-wide world. The Battle of Sinope takes place in 1853, and the Imperial Russian Navy moves in on the Ottoman Empire's navy, and it destroys all the Ottoman frigates, corvettes, and steamers in that one battle, leaving only losing only one ship on its own. This is, as you can imagine, makes the Ottoman Empire almost defenseless at this point. And as the war is heating up, Turkey blocks all grain from leaving the Black Sea. Blocks all grain from leaving the Black Sea. And this causes grain prices, to nearly double in France and Britain. This is what's happening today. This is what's happening now, in fact, as grain prices have doubled as the Black Sea has been blocked off. This is what happened in 1853. And it persuaded Britain and France together, had been rivals for centuries, to join together in a war against Russia, which can be called the Crimean War, from 1853 to 1856. In 1853, as grain prices double, David Dowes has a plan. David Dowes is a New York grain merchant. He is he's a person responsible, probably most responsible for the subway in New York, the creation of the subway in New York. He's a person you've probably never heard of. He's a multi-millionaire, though, and to make more money, he's persuaded that if he could consolidate some sort of corridor from Chicago, where all the cheap grain is, to New York, that he'll be able to sell grain in Europe. And this is the dream that inspires many of these people that I call the Boulevard Barons. They're people who are committed to building a railway corridor to the west, and by west I don't mean California, by west I mean basically Kansas, loading it up with grain and selling it in Europe. The fact that grain prices have doubled makes this an opportunity for them. This includes David Dowes, a name you probably haven't heard of, but it also recurs John Murray Forbes, somebody you maybe have. Forbes magazine is named after him. Who else? The Roosevelt family, you may have heard of them. They put a couple of presidents in the White House. These, along with a few other kind of major grain folks, try to buy up most of Western railroads and build a continuous corridor from the Midwest to the Atlantic Ocean. And so these Midwestern railroads to the free states, as they're called, boom after the Crimean War. And as I said before, railroads in the South don't really generally work because there's plenty of cotton, for example, or tobacco that goes from west to east down to the water. But because of slavery, because there aren't very many consumers in the South, there's very little on railroads that can go from east to west. And so what we see is a few railroads in the South and lots of railroads in the West and Midwest, and a massive boom in this expansion from 1853 to 1857. Once that war is over, though, in 1857, the United States has a financial panic because it's built up all this kind of capacity for grain exports, and it crumbles when Russia and Ukraine start exporting grain again. And so these are just two of the Boulevard Barons, but they are the people who ultimately, for example, fund John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry. They're called the Secret Six. They are the people who, or they're among the Secret Six. They're also, the Secret Six is a group of financial folks who had supported John Brown's raid in West Virginia in an attempt to allow Western Virginia to secede from the United States and cause a slave uprising. That failed and John Brown was killed. They're also the people who provide rifles to anti-slavery people in Kansas. They're also the people who help bring to the fore a railroad lawyer. A lawyer whose specialty is railroads. His specialty is the conflicts between states and railroads over land in the West. That's Abraham Lincoln. Their enemies in Congress are dominated by the F Street mess, the people I talked about before. And these 4 congressmen are the people who try to block what they call the corruptionists in the East, the corrupted railroad directors, the corrupted congressmen. And that conflict ultimately leads, they are the ones who demand that Stephen Douglas separate Nebraska territory into Kansas and Nebraska and make it possible for Kansas territorial people to determine whether there's slavery or freedom there. And that conflict, again, leads to civil war. That conflict initially in Congress, and then the fighting in Kansas, and then ultimately the election of Lincoln, which leads to civil war. I'm going to talk a little bit about how this changes grain distribution in the Civil War next time, but a spoiler, the U.S. wins, and 4 railroads connecting Chicago to New York are completed during the Civil War. This is the New York Central, the Erie, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the Baltimore and Ohio. And all 4 connect Chicago to the coast by 65. Back in Europe, however, the war is not going especially well for Russia. As you can imagine, France and Britain combined have a more powerful army. There are lots of problems with fighting a war in the Black Sea. One of the biggest ones is logistical problems. How do you get soldiers into the Black Sea, and then how do you feed them? So there are all sorts of problems with actually feeding French and British soldiers. Lots of them kind of die of basically fairly straightforward diseases like typhoid and it's here that Florence Nightingale in fact makes her first appearance in Istanbul. And it's Turkey, France, and Great Britain combined against Russia, and that combination ultimately defeats Russia. It's at the end of this war that Nicholas I dies. Some say from heartache, some say from suicide, and he passes on to his son Alexander II the problems of Russia. What are the problems of Russia? Well, Russia has just engaged in a 4-year-long war against all the powers of Europe, and except Germany, but all the major powers of Europe. And he has run up a tremendous debt for the Russian Empire to fight this war. And the person left holding the bag who's got to pay off all these debts once Russia surrenders is Alexander II. And Russia's whole framework for finance is a Russian bank, a central Russian bank, which has been lending money to serf owners, people who own serfs in lands, particularly in Russia and Ukraine. And it's fairly certain that these loans are going to have to be deferred, they won't be paid off. But Russia has a tremendous or a substantial foreign debt at this point, and it's on the verge of bankruptcy. This is where Russia is actually today. Russia now is on the verge of bankruptcy. It's on the verge now of not being able to make its payments in dollars for foreign treasury. This was precisely the problem that Russia faced in 1857 once the war was over, was how to pay this debt. Alexander II's solution comes from his finance minister, Julius Hagemeister, Hagemeister. And Hagemeister says, first of all, having visited Russia and Ukraine in the 1840s and 50s, he declares that slavery or serfdom as it exists in Russia and Ukraine will never succeed. That the most productive lands are areas that are 500 to 1,000 acres, run by families, and the ones with serf owners and serfs on them are not as successful. And loaning money to these large serf owners is just a failure. It's just not going to work. They're not going to be able to pay off these debts. And so Julius Hagermaster comes up with this fascinating idea. And the idea is to have the serfs pay the bills. And so that's where we get the liberation of serfdom in Russia, is a way to fix Russia's problems, particularly its immediate financial problems, connected with the near failure of its bank in 1857. Serfs will become free, but over a period of 20 to 30 years, initially 40 years, but then it shrinks over time. Over 40 years, they will pay the Russian state. In exchange, they will get their freedom and land, some land. And these payments that will be made by serfs for their freedom will come in as hundreds of millions of kopecks, which is the Russian currency at the time, and that this will kind of sustain and prop up the Russian bank. So serfdom ends at just around the same time that slavery ends. Serfdom ends in Russia in 1860, roughly 1860. The plan, though, starts in 1857. In 1860, the serfs start to pay off their freedom, but along with it, they are given land. Now, there are lots of problems with this. First of all, remember that Julius Hagemeister said you needed 500 to 1,000 acres of land, and those family farms were the most productive. These are not 500 acres. These are 30 acres, 30, 40 acres, sometimes less. And while free farms were certainly useful, what was needed was actually lots of day labor. And the most successful Ukrainian farms were actually farms of 1,000 or more acres. So this whole process of kind of unwinding the debt doesn't actually work especially well. But the principle is basically important, as you can imagine, for millions of serfs in Russia, is that they get their freedom. They're allowed to move from place to place in Russia. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the war initially between the Bullet Barbarians and the F Street Mess, which becomes a war between the North and the South, which becomes ultimately a war between poor white soldiers in the South and poor white soldiers in the North, ends in a kind of bloody surrender by the Confederacy. And the formerly enslaved pay the bills to a certain extent in this war by providing the labor that's necessary for the Union Army to succeed. The Union Army, as it builds railroads through the South, the U.S. military railroads, as it defends those railroads, pioneers, black pioneers, are the people who establish this. 130,000 black men are the kind of backbone of the Union Army. Some of them are soldiers, but many more of them are the kind of day laborers, the laborers that kind of make this Union policy of expansion by railroads, providing food over long distances to win the war against the Confederacy. So, okay. I had one other perfect slide, but I'll talk through it because it's complicated. So what does that mean about capitalism and slavery? Well, let's think about for a second who holds the bonds in Russia and who buys the bonds that David Dow's and the F Street Mess issue. In Russia, the people who take bonds from Russia, the people who basically pay a flat amount, say 120 pounds for Russian bonds, and then get continuous payments over time for those bonds, over say 20 years, are landholders, kind of middle and upper middle class and wealthy people, particularly mostly wealthy people in Great Britain, also Germany, also France. They hold these Russian state bonds. And those Russian state bonds are built on slavery or serfdom in Russia. That is, the loans that go out from these large capitalists in these three countries go to Russia. Russia uses those loans to then lend money to serf owners, who then effectively use their serfs to grow grain and sell it to Europe. Does that make sense, how that process works? So you have wealthy people in Europe buying Russian bonds and funding a kind of slave system in Russia, one that almost collapses as the Crimean War starts. In a bid to make Russia the largest world power in the Crimean War, Russia fails. And it fails so badly that this whole financial infrastructure built on serfdom is at the risk of collapsing. At the same time that this is happening, the United States railroads are issuing bonds in Great Britain, in France, and Germany. And those railroads work differently than, first of all, they're not premised on slavery, because Southern Railroad bonds don't sell. No one will buy a Southern Railway bond in Great Britain. But the bonds for Chicago, Missouri Central, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, these other railroads, which are grain railroads, are settled by non-slave and non-slave holding people, many of them immigrants. They take the land, and in a situation similar to the US Land Office, they take the land and they pay it off in 5-year installments to the railroads. The railroads take those payments and pay off the bondholders. And so this new system of bonds is different from the old system of bonds. One, the old system of bonds depends on slavery. The new system of bonds depends on effectively free land in the West. Free not in the sense that the land itself is not free, but the people who grow the grain are mostly family growers of grain. And over the 1850s and 1860s, as the Crimean War drags on, and as the Civil War drags on, increasingly Europeans are willing to buy bonds that are connected with free expansion in the West, as opposed to the expansion of serfdom in Russia. Capitalism and slavery is kind of fundamentally, if we think about slavery, it's since at least the time of Catherine the Great, has depended fundamentally on a kind of system of foreign bond selling that ultimately nearly collapses in the Crimean War. This new kind of capitalist system, I would argue, in which land is parceled out and mortgaged to free settlers, is one that ultimately Europeans embrace, and it's the system that ultimately prevails in two massive wars, two of the largest wars of the 19th century, the Crimean War and the American Civil War. And the aftermath of both of those is that slavery is ended. But there's an important difference in who benefits in Russia and who benefits in the United States. In Russia, the people who benefit to a certain extent are the serfs. I mean, they have to make these payments, but they are guaranteed access to land. The land is not large enough necessarily to produce large amounts of grain and to sell it in a way, so it may lead in the very long term to kind of Russian impoverishment. Some people have argued that. But they do have freedom and they do have their own land. For African Americans, formerly enslaved, their slavery ends in a bloody conflict as well, the American Civil War. They don't have to make these payments over the space of 30 years, but they don't get land either. And making formerly enslaved people landless over time is going to put them in a situation where they're constantly underwater, right? And ultimately, it's by the 1860s and 1870s that the formerly enslaved people are going to be denied the rights of citizenship. and ultimately be locked in a situation in which they cannot get access to land. That's a global difference that we can still see today. We'll talk about how the Civil War sort of logistics chain emerges and why it is that after the Civil War, the United States becomes the primary deliverer of grain to the rest of Europe. The fact that the US becomes a primary deliverer of grain to the rest of Europe helps explain ultimately US industrial and global power. So we'll talk about that in the next few days. All right, thanks so much.